couple of speakers ago, we heard with this wonderful English accent, professors can't dance. So, which I've proven his point just now, that he was indeed correct. Do your professors use PowerPoint at all? I think I use this several thousand years, so I'm kind of out here on the limit because I'm not using any PowerPoints. In the spirit of TED, what I have is one idea and 4 thoughts. That's it. So that's what I'm going to present today without PowerPoint. So I hope you hang in there with me because this is a bit challenging from away. What I'm talking about today is arguing that my generation, the boomers, have failed your generation in terms of how you want to be managed, led, maybe those are 2 strong words, how you want to be worked with. And at the core of that is simply this idea that you as a generation are postmodern. If you're under 35 and have a university education, you're postmodern in your worldview. If you're like me, over 45 and have a university education, you had a modern education. We've learned, but there's 2 different views of the world. I think those are disconnected, which means that we're failing you in some ways, and the world's going to have to change how we manage. So that's the argument I'm going to make. Now, that leaves 35 to 45-year-olds confused, and that's often the state they're in. But what it is that it's hard to say exactly when you had a postmodern education. So I can say over 45 modern, under 35 postmodern. That's why I do with that. Now, have you heard the term postmodern in your classes at all? Does that ring a bell? There's a famous quote from a U.S. Supreme Court justice about pornography. He said, "I can't define it, but I know it when I see it." And in my mind, postmodernism is like that. There's hundreds of definitions. So in our book, what we're doing, my co-author is McGill MBA, a lawyer, just going to work for McKinsey in January. What we're doing is we're not going to define postmodernism. We're going to have 5 chapters that talk about you and postmodernism. So we're going to have postmodern medicine, postmodern primary education, postmodern English literature, and postmodern music, and finally postmodern Christianity. Let me just talk for a moment about postmodern medicine to make it real to you. 2 thoughts. So postmodern medicine, when you go to see the doctor and she says you have a certain problem, on the way home, you pick out your iPhone and you Google it, the condition she said you had. Then the next time you see her the week later, you go back with a stack of documents this thick that you got off the internet. Is that not how you deal with your doctor? It's like that around the world. That's the postmodern view. What that talks about is hierarchy has declined dramatically. See, when I was a kid, if the doctor told something's wrong and wrote a script, your mother got it filled and you took it. That's just not the way it is today. Hierarchy has declined very dramatically. Second thought in medicine, postmodern medicine, is that we now have complementary medicines. So when I was a kid, or even 20 years ago, if you said someone's going to stick needles in you in acupuncture, I'd run screaming out of the room. Scary thought. But does anyone here ever had acupuncture? Just curious. Actually, quite a few people here have. So the thought is that today, the Western medicine is no longer privileged in the way it was in the past. We go to Chinese herbal medicine, maybe down in Chinatown, and an old guy there goes in the back and pulls out something. We take that, almost with the same confidence, perhaps not rightly, as we do from our Western medicine. So that's an example how the world has changed. The postmodern medicine, the world has changed dramatically. We've gone to a very different place. So we've looked at postmodernism in music, and I think the last talk, Aaron talked, kind of got into that in a way. And what we're saying is that I'm going to talk about how to manage people, but I want to talk about 5 or 6 key ideas of postmodernism. The first one is that there's less truth with a capital T than there used to be. So truth used to be this big, but it's now this big. Some people say there's none at all. I disagree with that, but there's certainly a lot less. But there's more truth, a lot more truth with a small t out there. So that truth is now much more diffused than it was in the past. It's interesting. I remember I had the flu when I was 10 years old. Being an organized child, I got down Britannica, and I read the first article in the first volume. It was aardvarks, because they have 2 A's in their name. Good advertising. And I read the article on aardvarks. It was written by a professor of zoology from Harvard who wrote the definitive article on aardvarks. What do we do today when my son Eric and Marie-Ève, they're 13 and 11, are at the dinner table? We Google on our Apple, whatever it might be. And if we were concerned about aardvarks, we get that out. And who writes that article? Well, a community does. a bunch of people are in an aardvark. There's probably a 10-year-old girl who's got one in her backyard, and she goes out, picks it up, and says, yes, it's got a tail. And so the thought is that knowledge is different than it used to be. Truth is much more diffused than it used to be. The second thought is we've gone from the search for universalities for the search for variability. What I want to do is I see that, oh, that's the time left. Boy, I almost had a heart attack. I thought I'd spoken for 12 minutes. So sorry about that. There is some truth. That number is a true number, I guess. So we're looking for, instead of universal truths, like the 7 laws of success, what we're looking for now is variability. What we want is to get away from central truths, to look for things on the periphery, things that are on the edge. We want to find those things because that's where new ideas, and that's where creativity comes from. We absolutely empower that. Now, it's interesting that when we think about something we taught 5 years ago is getting out of date. 10 years ago is severely out of date. I've taught a course on globalization for about 15 years, and 15 years ago, we did not mention China or India at all. It'd be hard to talk about globalization today without China and India. It keeps changing. Truth and knowledge changes much more rapidly than when I went to university. It's a different world altogether. So those things go on. Those things change. 2 other thoughts. One is that when I worked for IBM, if someone got emotional, we'd stop the meeting and have coffee. So what we do is we'd say, it's all about what's in the mind. There's a famous show from the 60s called Dragnet. Your parents would know it. And there's a character called Sergeant Friday in it. And he was known for a famous line. Does anybody know that line? Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. This shows who is older in the audience. And what the thought was that he was a homicide detective, kind of, the CSI, the Law and Order of his day. But what he was saying is to the grieving widow, whose husband was killed 2 hours before, stop crying, ma'am. Just give me the facts. I think she was pretty reasonably upset at the time. But he was doing it for a good cause, to find the guy that killed her husband. And she'd be agreeing that's good. But it was just the facts. What we wanted back in IBM when I worked there was just analysis, just the facts, no emotions. Get them off the table. That's the world I grew up in. And the final one is saying the world is a bit different because in the postmodern world, what we're looking for now is meaning and purpose. Now, we want meaning and purpose in our lives. That the idea of his and hers matching blue BMWs, a 4-bedroom house with an in-ground pool, is simply not adequate to define our lives. And for too many of my fellow boomers, it was. We had a high need for achievement. We wanted to win. We wanted to be better. Therefore, that's how we looked at the world. Your generation is saying hogwash. Well, you're saying something probably more colorful, but that's what I would say. And you're saying utter nonsense, that's not adequate for a human life. We want something better and deeper, more profound than that. So these are some of the ideas of postmodernism. I hope they resonate with you. And what I'd like to focus on the last few minutes here is saying, I want to look at 4 ideas of how your generation wants to be managed, to be led, to be worked with. I think led is a strong word for postmodern people. It's too strong a word. You want to be worked with, even if I'm older than you. So the first one is, what we've moved from is from the person, like this classroom, it's all about the person at the front. It slants down to the voice of knowledge and truth, which in this case. But the thought is that the classroom is designed to privilege one person, where that's not at all postmodern. Because the thought is that we're privileging all voices, not just the one at the front, not just the one person. I remember I wrote an essay in grade 10 about Shakespeare. It's about Macbeth. You probably took Macbeth in grade 10. The curriculum doesn't change in Canada that often, evidently. And I wrote it. I remember my teacher giving it back with a large red X through it and saying, "You're wrong." We had a delivered truth in that day, and I was wrong. Today we say I was creative. I had an interesting perspective. So what we're looking at is saying we've gone from an age of deference to an age of reference. That the deference to authority in the past is simply not there today. Just because you're old and you're at the front doesn't mean that your will, your knowledge rules. Your story is as good as my story. Is your honest feeling. Now, you might say, hey, you've studied something, written a book about it, maybe you actually know something, but it's not this kind of difference, it's maybe that kind of difference. And maybe I'm just out of date, and maybe you're with it and more cool than I am. Not likely, but it's possible. It's possible. I love the fact that Erin used the word groovy. But I leaned forward to Allie and I said, do we use groovy anymore? And she says no. So I felt that, Erin and I connected, but it's not groovy. Or maybe it's coming back and she's out of date. I think Allie's out of date, which is hard to believe. So when we think about it here, what we're saying is that senior managers, the people that want to lead you, simple advice: talk less, listen more. The thought is, with your generation, you must be heard when it comes to decisions. So what you need to do, if I'm managing or working with you, I need to have you join into the conversation. And it's going to take longer. This is irritating. Decisions are going to take longer to get to, but that's all right, because they're going to be better decisions, because you have input. You have knowledge and things to bring to the table. Now, your generation, this is good news for people my age, are happy for me to make a decision if you've been heard. And as long as I don't let Allie always win, but I let Bob win once in a while too, then it's all right. So you're not against me making a decision as the senior person. You want to be heard. So simple advice: talk more. Wait a minute. Talk less, listen more. I'll get that straight. Second thought is the rise of the periphery. This is multiculturalism writ large, if you would. The rise of the periphery. Now, this is a business need, is innovation. We need innovation more in a recession and more in an era of globalization than we've had in the past. Why? Because our competitors are bringing ideas from around the world to beat us up in our home markets. Around the world. We're doing it to them, they're doing it to us. Everything's speeded up. Everything's more difficult. Therefore, we need to be successful, more innovation. Innovation does not come from homogeneity, but from differences. It comes from the periphery. Creativity comes from the outside, the edges, rather than the things at the center. So what we have to do is in the modern parlance, is to seek diversity and embrace it. So what I don't want is a bunch of old white men like myself. Okay, older white men, middle-aged white men, only in the room. What I want is some young people. What I want is women. What I want is people of different races, because from that, we'll be more successful. And that's simply the reality of this room when I look around. It is simply, but it's not necessarily the reality of the boardroom. And that's something that, from a selfish capitalist viewpoint, not because it's morally right, but because I want to make more money, I need to embrace diversity. Because that's what you are. It's just the way it is. Third one of the fourth now is simply we've got to recognize emotions are absolutely critical. There's an idea from a professor in California called flow. If you've ever heard that idea. What it says is simply is that a small percentage of our workforce is fully engaged. And what we want at work is to be in flow. Flow is when you say, oh, it's 3 o'clock, I forgot to eat lunch. Because I was so engaged in what I was doing. Sometimes it's out of terror and fear. I've had bosses like that. But at the best of the times, it's because I'm writing, and I'm right into it. Or maybe when I play my saxophone, time flies by, or playing with the kids. Or I know it's Monday nights when I play ice hockey in the over 35 league. We always say the game ended much too soon. We never, ever say, I got too much ice time. We love chasing that little black puck around, and time flies, and it's wonderful. What we want, you want, is to have that at work. And you're not going to have a job where you don't get into flow. We want to engage you emotionally. Now, this has always been true. You remember Braveheart with Mel Gibson? One of those great scenes, he's on top of a horse, he's painted blue for some obscure reason, and he's riding up and down his horse in front of the Scots, and he's getting them all upset about the English, and let's go kill them. That's emotion, and it's raw, isn't it? Stir them up, send them out. So emotion is nothing new, but your generation wants it on steroids, if you would. You want it, so not a good example, to the power of 3. You want to be emotionally engaged, and that's wonderful. So the idea, the management advice is go with the flow. And make sure you have flow at work for your employees, for your generation. Fourth point, a renewed need for purpose. It used to be that do some work with big law firms here in Canada, that you'd wait till you're in your 40s to do pro bono work. When you were successful, then you might start giving back later in life. Your generation wants purpose and meaning from day one. You're not satisfied with just checking some boxes. You're not satisfied with just piling up the goodies and defining yourself by the toys that you have. The best-selling book, one of the best-selling books in the last decade was called A Purpose-Filled Life. It was written by a pastor in the U.S., but a lot of atheists must have bought it because it had huge sales. And it was very religious, but it got to, I think, a critical element of our thinking these days, looking for meaning and purpose. And so I think you have to find meaning and purpose at work right away. So work must have meaning, is my fourth point, if you would, from that viewpoint. So what I've talked about today is simply saying that your generation, people under 35 with university education, the world you live in here at McGill is postmodern. That's the way you've been brought up. That's how you see it. Now, as a modern, my education was different, but I've been alive the whole time you have. I think that's a self-evident truth. So the thought is that I can understand a bit of your world, but what I'm arguing today is that our organizations must change substantially as you become more and more important. Because people like me over 45 run the world. And now that I'm that age, that's all right. We have the wisdom and experience. But the people who do the work of the organization are under 35. People like you. And you are the future, very clearly. Now, some baby boomers, when I talk about this, get upset and they don't like postmodernism, they don't like your generation. And I find that difficult because I'm really lucky as a university professor that I spend a lot of time with people that are 20 years old. Get to go on trips with them, I got to teach them, I hang out with, have coffee with them. It's a delight. Tom Brokaw is a very well-known U.S. journalist that said your grandparents was the greatest generation. My naive view is that you have the same potential. Now, the story is only beginning to be writ. It's not over. It won't be over 40 or 50 years. We'll leave that to a future person to say whether you are also a great generation. But I hang around with you, and I think you have great potential to solve the incredible problems that the world's facing now. And the boomers, we're going to have to start passing the baton to you. But I have great confidence in you, and our hope and our prayers are with you. Bonne chance.